In this video, I'm going to focus on disassembling and showing you everything that's inside the Splatrball gearbox and how it works and how to take it apart and put it back together. If you want to see a video of how to disassemble the whole blaster, then check out some of my other videos where I show you how to disassemble and reassemble the blaster. This is just going to be about the gearbox. So this gearbox is actually a copy of a V3 Airsoft gearbox. It is extremely similar to the V3 Airsoft gearbox. So that you can visualize how similar it is to a V3 Airsoft gearbox, this is a plastic V3 Airsoft gearbox. For Airsoft, this gearbox was never really designed to be made out of plastic, it was designed to be made out of metal. So I would not buy a plastic Airsoft gearbox because they made some improvements to the gel blaster version to be in plastic that they don't have for this plastic gearbox. Like for example here, there's a screw here in front of the trigger that holds the gearbox together there. This one, Airsoft one, does not have that, and what I noticed is that the gearbox wants to kind of split apart there and the trigger pins come out of their seat like this. So that's no good. You don't want that to happen. So you don't want to buy a plastic Airsoft gearbox to replace this. Now we're going to talk about how to upgrade this gearbox using Airsoft parts in another video, but I just wanted to show you in this one how similar they are. The main difference is that the plunger on the gel blaster one is longer, and the cylinder head is going to be a different shape because there's a tappet that has to move back further to allow the bigger gel balls to load, and the tappet is going to be a little bit different shape and profile. Other than that, they share a lot of the same components, they use the same gears, and they use the same motors, and even like the motor frame and stuff like that. A lot of the parts are going to be cross-compatible. One other slight difference is the selector plate. The selector plate is different on this gel blaster one than it is on the Airsoft one. So you'll notice like this one has some gears and stuff like that that go on this other side here, and you'll see that this gel blaster even still has those features there. So, but it doesn't have any of those gears. So you can just take those gears off, and then your selector plate is going to be different up here. And so that would have to be slightly modified if you use an Airsoft gearbox. Or you may have to do away with single fire mode or something and just do full auto mode. Another difference with the gel blaster one is that with the gel blaster one, you can actually remove the spring out the back without taking the gearbox apart. Most Airsoft gearboxes do not have quick change spring access from the back. But if I purchased an Airsoft gearbox to replace this one, I would definitely get one with the quick change spring access so you can swap out the springs more easily. The Airsoft gearboxes come with this, I don't know what this is at the top here, but the gel blaster ones do not, but you can see that they have the feature there to hold something like that, but they don't even use that for anything. This feature here in the back is intended for a set screw to be able to adjust the motor position and the mesh with the gears. In this case, they didn't even care about that, and they just have the motor's just loose, and so it's not meshing as perfectly with the gears as it could be. Therefore, it can easily strip that first bevel gear that the Pinion is driving. An Airsoft gearbox, by contrast, has a set screw in here. You can see it's even got Loctite or something on it that you can use to adjust the motor position. And like this one still has some play there, but you would use that screw to push that forward and adjust the motor until there's the minimum amount of play that you want. First thing here we're going to do is remove this motor mount, and then we can pull the motor off like that, and we should be able to remove these wires here. Let's remember which side was which. The red was on top, because if you wire them backwards, the whole thing's going to want to turn backwards. One thing I want to point out with this motor pinion gear is that this is a D-shaft pinion gear. So if you buy a new one, like a metal one, it has to be a D-shaft type motor pinion gear. You should be able to slide this pinion gear off by pushing it forward like that with this flathead screwdriver. And there it goes. Bye-bye. And so here you can see the flat on the shaft. That's a D shaft. And you can see the pinion is D-shaped. And if you had a plastic pinion, you just slide it back on. If you had a metal pinion, you slide it back on. And I think there's a set screw in the metal pinions also. Slide it all the way in until it stops. Second, we should take out the spring in the back here. Maybe you can just shove a screwdriver in here and help twist that out like that to remove that spring. So if you wanted to replace the motor, you could undo this bracket here, take those screws out. So this clips on like that over it. So when you're disassembling it, you take this off like that. You would take this motor out, make sure the spring doesn't bounce off somewhere. You have this shim back here, shim washer. That shim is probably, if you have a screw in there, if you have a set screw, then the set screw is pushing up against the shim and not the motor shaft. But that shim also moves the motor forward. So you want to make sure that that shim, you don't lose that it's still in there. When you go to put things back together, put the motor in first, put the spring behind the wall up here, put the shim in, and then take this front and hook it over the teeth right here and down, and then you can screw it back together. All right, now to get to the main part of the gearbox, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 screws. And then the top is held together by a piece of sheet metal. Okay, let's take these screws out here. So these 3 screws are the same length here. 14.5 millimeters, have a diameter of 2.96. This screw right here is smaller in diameter and also about 14.5, but its diameter is 2.58. And this screw up here is very short, and it has a machine thread, not a plastic thread, 3.5 millimeters in length. Before you do anything else after the screw removal, you're going to need to slide this piece of metal off the top here out the front towards the nozzle. You need to use like a flathead screwdriver to get it like started here, like that. So just get it started going because it has a locking tab there, and then you can push it off the front. And once you get it part of the way off, you can pull it with some pliers or pull it with your hands. There you go. That came off a little bit easier. I kind of struggled at first trying to push it, but the main thing is to get it over these locking tabs here, and you can use a flathead screwdriver to kind of push it and get it forward, get it going, pry it off of these. Trying to do any damage to it. This shape of this metal piece grabs onto the dovetails up here. Before we can open this gearbox, we still have this plastic piece here right behind the trigger that's holding the gearbox together. There we go. Now it's time to open up this gearbox. Now be careful because everything's under a little bit of spring-loaded pressure, so things are going to kind of spring apart a little bit. And you also do not want to lose any of the bearings or shims that you'll find in here. Okay, so here we see like what I was talking about. There's a shim right there. Looks like a little washer. So you don't want to lose these shims. You can take it and put it back on the gear from which it came. It's the easiest way to reassemble things afterwards. So since there's spring-loaded pressure, everything kind of pops apart. It's hard to show exactly how all the stuff works together, but I'm going to put it back in as best as I can. Okay, this is approximately what things will look like once you've opened it up. So if you take a look here, you can see the ratchet pawl under there that's spring-loaded. Here's our set of 3 main gears after the motor pinion. So this is the bevel drive gear, which goes to the middle spur gear, which goes to the sector gear here. This is called a sector gear because only about half of the circle has gear teeth to drive the piston. So the gear turns, it pulls the piston back, and then when there's no more teeth, the piston shoots forward before the gear grabs it again and pulls it back again. This is the tappet here. The tappet in this case has a metal tappet. Most tappets are plastic. And this feature right here on the sector gear is what pushes the tappet back and pulls the plunger back like this, such that a new gel ball can load into the T-piece and then be pushed forward, and then the piston can fire it. There's also a ratchet pawl here underneath the bevel gear, and that ratchet pawl prevents the spring-loaded piston from backdriving the mechanism. So here you see the ratchet pawl clicking. Okay, I'm going to start disassembling this. So the first gear I'm going to take out is this bevel gear. And the bevel gear has shielded ball bearings on either side of it. If we take these ball bearings out, you'll notice that there's also a shim there. It's got a shim on one side. And then there's a shim here on the other side, also under the bearing. This bearing has a shim there. So when you put that back together, you need to make sure to put the shims in place. So this bevel gear, it's got a big ring bevel gear here. It's got ratchet teeth features here, and then it has a small spur gear here that drives the next spur gear. I'm going to put this back together with the shim first, then the bearing with the flange on the inside, and then put this shim on with the bearing with the flange on the inside again here. Next we have our ratchet pawl here. This ratchet pawl is what prevents the gears from backdriving. So the ratchet pawl is spring-loaded. The spring is under the ratchet pawl on the bottom side. One leg pushes up against here, and then the bent leg of the spring catches the ratchet pawl and pushes it into the ratchet. So we're going to take this out carefully to show you what it looks like underneath, like that. If it comes apart, then you have the spring left like that, and you need to put the spring on like this over the ratchet pawl. The next gear is a large spur gear, and here the bearings are plastic, but there is a shim on both sides. So there's a shim on this side here, and a little shim on this side too. This bearing is plastic in the housing, so it's a plastic bushing. This next gear is a sector gear. It also has a shim on both sides of it. There's a shim on this side and a shim on the back side. The sector gear has the drive spur gear on the bottom, and the sector gear portion on the top, and then the tappet plate cam. So now I'm going to go ahead and take out the piston. So the piston is composed of a few pieces. There's the main body of the piston. You have the gear teeth, which are integrated in this case on this plastic piston. And then there's a very loose O-ring here. This O-ring is intentionally loose because it has to kind of move back and forth, and it has to seal, and it has to also allow air to pass through on the reverse stroke. Then you have the screw here that holds the piston head onto the piston housing. I'm going to take out the piston cylinder. So the piston cylinder is made of aluminum. It's ported on one side, and you should be able to remove it. Yes, here we go. So this is the piston head. Now the piston head is going to be a little bit different from the Airsoft piston head because it's going to have a longer space here for a longer motion of the plunger. There's a liberal amount of grease on everything. The piston head piece that comes out is aluminum, the rest is plastic. This looks like brass or plated aluminum, not sure what that plunger piece is. One thing to check is the compression, how good the compression is. As long as the piston head doesn't come out, the compression is pretty good. But that's the compression when it's tight. So this has pretty good compression. There's no air leak like I've seen like on some cheaper blasters. There's air leaks. The plunger feels pretty loose on the piston head, so there's probably going to be a little bit of air leaks around there. Now we can remove the tappet plate. So the tappet plate is spring-loaded forward. This tappet plate is die cast. Looks like this part is bent here already a little bit, which I don't know if that's supposed to be like that or not. I guess that could, if that gets bent like that, then that could cause the gels to not feed properly. It seems pretty strong, but I can still bend it back with my hands. Now all that we have left in here is the trigger assembly parts. And it's pretty complicated just for the trigger assembly, but what it does is it allows it to switch between single fire and automatic. So these contacts right here are the on-off switch. So in this position, it would be off and it wouldn't work at all. That's the off position of the selector switch. Now when you move it to this position, it's going to be on in single fire mode. And in single fire mode, the cam on the back of the sector gear, there's a little cam right here. It pushes this lever here every time that it rotates, and it lets it know that there's been one shot fired. So in single fire mode, it pushes forward, it rides over the cam arm, and then when the cam comes around and pushes on this, it releases it. So every time that sector gear comes around in single fire mode, it releases that, and then you have to let go of the trigger to reset. Then you can do it again, and then the cam comes around on the sector gear and releases the switch. So the single fire mode is completely mechanical. When you put this selector switch into automatic, you can see it pulls the cam away, cam gets pulled up, and when you pull the switch, it makes the contact, and then this is not doing anything. Every time the cam comes around, this cam arm is not doing anything, so it just continues to fire. It doesn't release the switch. So if you're having issues with the blaster just not doing anything when you pull the trigger, when it's in fire mode, then you may have issues with this contact switch here or this electrical contact on the outside here, because these two contacts are where electricity has to pass through in order to make the motor turn. So you might want to check out those two contacts and make sure that everything is working well in there and that there's no corrosion on this stuff. It's probably good to use a little bit of electrical grease on these contacts. You can buy automotive bulb grease to put on the contacts that help with electrical connection and prevent corrosion of the contacts. Okay, so now we can take the trigger off here. And what we're going to find is the trigger is kind of like two pieces hinged together. They just slot into each other like that. There's a torsion spring right here. It looks like it's stuck in place. And we can remove this switch box from this one screw here. It's a pretty small screw. And then we can take the switch box out. It's going to come apart with the slider here attached to this spring. Let me take this spring out. And so here we have just the switch box itself, and we have the power contacts. Here, this is to turn it on, and we have the switch contacts right here. So these are in series, so the power contacts have to be closed in order for the switch contacts to work. So if we want to take this apart for any reason, that's a medium-sized screw there, flathead screw on a plastic piece, and this contact comes out. This contact is connected to this other contact in here, and we can remove this screw here. This is the longest of the 3 screws. And then there's a sort of like T-piece that comes out here, and we have this contact that can be removed, and it's hooked up to the red motor wire. And this is all that's left of the switch box. So you could remove also this electrical contact here. This could come out. There's an O-ring in here. I'm just going to leave this on there. And now we're going to reassemble everything. So I'm going to take this contact, put it back in here, slide the O-ring back over, like that. Take this T-piece, put it back in here. Take the longer screw. Okay, now we're going to take this electrical contact that's passing through the gearbox housing and set it here on top. And find this plate with the medium-sized flathead screw. Screw that in there. Make sure that this contact is properly seated. If it's out of alignment, it may not work well anymore. Okay, now this is ready to be put back onto the gearbox housing. We have to slide this switch. Oops. I'm going to slide the switch in here. Put the spring on top of the switch slider. Put the spring over this post. And then seat this whole switch assembly. I'm going to use this tiny little screw. Okay, now the trigger is going to go back in place, and we have to get this trigger over this torsion spring. So it's a little bit tricky here. I was able to just kind of